The candlelight struck the silver platters along the supper table just as Dominic Xavier heard his sister's voice slice through the warm hum of conversation. And he knew instantly that the peace of the evening had shattered before the first course was even cleared. "How clever of you, brother, to have your servant join us at table," Marian said, her tone honeyed and venomous at once. "I suppose on the frontier, distinctions of rank matter less than they ought." The room fell silent. Dominic's hand tightened on his wine cup, and across the table he saw Hala Brighthorn go very still, her green fingers frozen halfway to setting down a basket of bread. She had changed from her work dress into the simple but clean linen gown he had given her, and her dark hair was braided neatly back from her face. Her tusks, small and white against her green skin, showed just slightly as her lips parted in what might have been the beginning of a response, but no sound came. The other guests, neighbors from the surrounding farmsteads and a wool merchant from the crossroads town, shifted in their seats. Dominic felt the weight of their eyes, some curious, some uncomfortable, some already hardening with judgment. He rose slowly, setting down his cup with deliberate care. The chair scraped against the wooden floor. His heartbeat was steady, his hands calm, but there was steel in his spine as he looked at his sister across the length of the table. "This is Hala Brighthorn," he said, and his voice carried clearly through the dining hall. "She is not my servant. She is my beloved, and she will be mistress of this house." Marian's face went white, then red. Hala's eyes widened, her gaze snapping to his, and he saw a complex storm of emotion there: surprise, hope, fear, and something raw that she tried to hide by looking down at the breadbasket still clutched in her hands. "Dominic," Marian began, her voice shaking, but he held up a hand. "You will apologize to her," he said quietly, "or you will leave this table." The silence stretched out, broken only by the crackle of the fire in the hearth. Marian's jaw worked, her eyes bright with angry tears, and then she pushed back her chair and swept from the room, her skirts hissing against the floor. A moment later, the sound of a door slamming echoed through the house. Dominic exhaled slowly and turned to the remaining guests. "Forgive the disruption," he said, forcing warmth back into his voice. "Please continue. The lamb is excellent this year." The merchant cleared his throat and reached for his knife. The neighbors exchanged glances, and gradually the murmur of conversation resumed, though it was stilted and careful. Dominic sat back down and looked at Hala, who still stood frozen at the sideboard where she had been helping to bring out the dishes. "Sit with me," he said gently, gesturing to the empty chair beside him. "Please." She hesitated, her fingers white-knuckled on the basket. Then, slowly, she set it down and moved to the chair. She sat as though the wood might break beneath her, her back straight, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Dominic reached beneath the table and found her hand, squeezing it once. Her skin was warm and rough from work, and she squeezed back, just for a heartbeat, before pulling away. The meal dragged on. Dominic played the gracious host, steering the conversation toward safe topics: the harvest, the price of wool, the new mill wheel at the creek. The neighbors were polite, but he could see the questions in their eyes, the way they glanced at Hala when they thought no one was watching. She said nothing, ate little, and kept her gaze mostly on her plate. When the last of the guests finally departed, their thanks and farewells more perfunctory than usual, Dominic closed the door and leaned against it, suddenly tired. The house was too quiet. He heard the clatter of dishes from the kitchen and followed the sound. Hala was at the wash basin, scrubbing a platter with fierce intensity, her shoulders hunched. He watched her for a moment from the doorway, the lamplight casting her shadow long against the stone wall. "You should not have said that," she said without turning around. Her voice was low and rough, strained. In front of everyone. I meant it, Dominic said. You do not know what you have done. She set the platter down with a clatter and braced her hands on the edge of the basin. Your sister is right. I was hired help. I came here because I had nowhere else to go. I know, Dominic said, stepping into the kitchen. You told me when you arrived. Then you know I have nothing. She turned to face him then, and there was anguish in her dark eyes. My clan's lands were taken when the border was redrawn. We were scattered. I worked where I could find work. I came here to tend your dairy because you offered fair wages and a place to sleep. That is all. That is not all, Dominic said. He moved closer, stopping just out of arm's reach. Not anymore. Hala shook her head, her jaw tight. You are a landowner. Your family has held this estate for generations. I am, she broke off, her voice cracking. You are the woman I have been waiting for, Dominic said quietly, even before I knew it. She closed her eyes, and he saw the sheen of tears on her lashes. You are kind, she said. You have always been kind, but kindness is not enough. Then what is? Dominic asked. Tell me. She opened her eyes and looked at him, and the pain there was almost too much to bear. You deserve someone who can stand beside you as an equal, she said. Not someone who came to you with nothing but calloused hands and desperation. Dominic felt something hot and fierce rise in his chest. Hala, he said, and he heard the roughness in his own voice. I do not care what you came with. I care who you are. You do not understand, she said, shaking her head again. Your sister, she fears I will take what is hers, and she is not wrong. If I stay, if we, she stumbled over the words, her face flushing darker green. Your family will hate me. Your neighbors already look at me as though I am something other. And I am an orc. No amount of love will change that. I do not want to change it, Dominic said. He stepped closer, close enough now that he could see the fine lines at the corners of her eyes, the way her pointed ears twitched slightly when she was upset. Hala, listen to me. I do not care about my sister's fears or my neighbor's opinions. I care about you. I have cared about you since the day you showed up at my door, exhausted and weary, and still looked me straight in the eye when you asked for work. That is not love, Hala said, but her voice was shaking. That is pity. No, Dominic said firmly. Pity is not what made me look for excuses to come to the dairy barn every morning. Pity is not what made me stay up late listening to you talk about your clan's songs and the way the grasslands look in spring. Pity is not what makes my heart race when you laugh. He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and took her hand. I am not good with words, Hala, but I know what I feel, and I know that you feel it too. She looked down at their joined hands, her breath hitching. I do, she whispered. I have tried not to. I told myself it was foolish. That you were simply a good man, a kind employer, that I was imagining the way you looked at me. She lifted her gaze to his, and her eyes were full of tears. But I am not imagining it, am I? No, Dominic said. You are not. A tear slipped down her cheek, and she wiped it away roughly with her free hand. I do not know how to do this, she said. I do not know how to be what you need me to be. You do not have to be anything but yourself, Dominic said. He lifted her hand and pressed his lips to her knuckles, a gentle, deliberate gesture. But I will not lie to you, Hala. This will not be easy. My sister is angry and frightened, and she will not let this go without a fight. The neighbors will talk. Some of them will turn away from us. There will be people who refuse to see you as anything but. He stopped, his jaw tightening. A monster, Hala finished quietly. You can say it. I have heard it before. Then they are fools, Dominic said, and I will not bend to fools. She smiled then, a small, trembling smile that did not quite reach her eyes. You are either very brave or very stupid, she said. Perhaps both, Dominic admitted, and he smiled back. But I am also very stubborn. Hala laughed, a short, watery sound, and then she pulled her hand from his and turned back to the wash basin. I need to finish the dishes, she said. Leave them, Dominic said. We can do them in the morning. I cannot just leave them, Hala said. It is she stopped, her shoulders sagging. Old habits. Dominic stepped up beside her and picked up a towel. Then I will help you, he said. They worked in silence for a while, the rhythm soothing after the chaos of the evening. Dominic dried the dishes as Hala washed them, and he found himself stealing glances at her profile, the strong line of her jaw, the way her braid had come slightly loose and curled against her neck. When the last dish was stacked away, Hala dried her hands and turned to face him. What will you do about your sister? She asked. Talk to her, Dominic said. In the morning when she has had time to calm down. And if she does not calm down, Hala asked. If she refuses to accept this, Dominic hesitated. Then I will make it clear where my loyalties lie, he said. This is my home, Hala, not hers. She is welcome here, but not at your expense. Hala looked at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. You would choose me over your own blood? She asked quietly. Yes, Dominic said without hesitation. I would. She drew in a shaky breath and nodded. Then I suppose I had better be worth it, she said, and there was a faint, fragile edge of humor in her voice. You already are, Dominic said. They stood there in the warm kitchen, the lamplight flickering, and for a moment it felt as though the rest of the world had fallen away. Then Hala stepped back, breaking the spell, and wrapped her arms around herself. I should go to bed, she said. It will be a long day tomorrow. Hala, Dominic said, and she paused at the doorway. Thank you. She looked back at him, her brows drawn together in confusion. For what? For staying, he said. For not leaving after what happened tonight. Hala was quiet for a moment, and then she nodded. Good night, Dominic, she said, and slipped out of the kitchen. Dominic stood alone in the empty room, the echoes of the evening settling around him like dust. He pinched the bridge of his nose and let out a long breath. Then he extinguished the lamp and made his way upstairs to the guest room where Marion was staying. He knocked once, lightly, and waited. There was no answer. He knocked again. Marion, he said, I know you are awake. A pause, and then her voice, muffled and sharp. Go away. No, Dominic said. We need to talk. There is nothing to talk about, Marion said. You have made your choice perfectly clear. Dominic sighed and rested his forehead against the door. Marion, please open the door. Another long silence, and then he heard the scrape of a chair and footsteps. The door opened a crack, and Marion's face appeared, pale and red-eyed. She had been crying. What do you want? She asked. To understand, Dominic said, why you would say something so cruel to Hala. Marion's face twisted. Cruel, she said. Dominic, she is an orc. She came here looking for work. You took her in out of pity, and now she broke off, shaking her head. You are going to ruin everything. Ruin what? Dominic asked, keeping his voice gentle. Tell me what you are afraid of. Marion's eyes filled with tears again. This estate has been in our family for 4 generations, she said. Father entrusted it to you when he died because you were the eldest son. But if you take an orc as your wife, her voice broke, the neighbors will turn on you. The town will shun you, and when you die, what then? Will our family name be inherited by half-orc children? Will everything father built be passed to my children? Dominic interrupted quietly. Yes, that is how inheritance works, Marion. But she is not one of us, Marion said desperately. She does not belong here. She does now, Dominic said. I have made that clear. Marion stared at him, her face crumpling. And what about me? She asked, her voice small. What about my future? I have no husband, no estate of my own. This is all I have, Dominic. And now you are bringing in a stranger, an orc, and I am supposed to smile and accept it. Dominic felt a pang of sympathy despite his anger. Marion, he said gently. "You are my sister. You will always have a place here. But I will not allow you to treat Hala as less than she is." "And what is she?" Marion demanded. "You said she is your beloved, but what does that mean? Is she your wife, your betrothed, or just a dalliance that you are trying to dignify with pretty words?" Dominic felt his temper flare. "She is the woman I love," he said, his voice hardening, "and I will marry her if she will have me." Marion flinched as though he had struck her. "You are serious," she whispered. "Yes," Dominic said. "I am." Marion stepped back, her hand on the door. "Then you are a fool," she said, and slammed it in his face. Dominic stood there for a moment, his jaw tight, and then he turned and walked away. The next morning dawned cold and gray, with the promise of rain hanging heavy in the air. Dominic woke early, as was his habit, and dressed quickly. He found Hala already in the dairy barn, milking the cows with the same quiet efficiency she always did. She looked up when he entered, her expression guarded. "Good morning," he said. "Good morning," she replied, and turned back to the cow. Dominic grabbed a stool and settled beside her, starting on the next cow in line. They worked in companionable silence for a while, the rhythmic sound of milk hitting the pails soothing and familiar. "Did you sleep well?" Dominic asked after a while. "Not particularly," Hala admitted. "You?" "Not particularly," Dominic echoed, and she huffed a faint laugh. "What did your sister say?" Hala asked. Dominic hesitated. "She is frightened," he said carefully. "She fears for the estate, for her own future. She does not understand." "She understands perfectly well," Hala said, her voice flat. "She sees an orc who has no claim to anything, and she fears I will take what should be hers." "This estate is not hers," Dominic said. "It is mine, and I will leave it to whomever I choose." Hala was quiet for a moment, her hand stilling on the udder. "That is what she fears," she said softly, "that you will choose me." "I already have," Dominic said. Hala looked at him then, her dark eyes searching his face. "Why?" she asked. "Truly, Dominic, why me?" Dominic set down the pail and turned to face her fully. "Do you remember the first day you came here?" he asked. Hala nodded slowly. "I was exhausted," she said. "I had been walking for days. I had heard you were looking for someone to help with the dairy, and I hoped you might not turn me away just because I was an orc. You stood in my yard, covered in dust, and you looked at me like you were ready to fight if I said no," Dominic said, and he smiled at the memory. "But you did not fight. You just asked very calmly if I had work, and when I said yes, you nodded and asked where the barn was. You did not thank me, you did not grovel, you just got to work." "I needed the job," Hala said quietly. "I did not have the luxury of pride." "Maybe," Dominic said. "But you had dignity. You have always had dignity, Hala, even when others tried to take it from you." He reached out and brushed a strand of hair from her face. "That is what I saw in you. That is what I still see." Hala closed her eyes, leaning into his touch for just a moment. "I do not feel dignified," she murmured. "I feel like I am clinging to something that does not belong to me." "It does belong to you," Dominic said firmly, "if you want it." Hala opened her eyes and looked at him, and he saw the raw vulnerability there, the fear and the hope tangled together. "I do," she whispered. "I want it so much it frightens me." "Then take it," Dominic said. "Take me, take this life, and let me stand beside you while you do." Hala drew in a shaky breath and nodded. "All right," she said. "All right." Dominic smiled and kissed her forehead, a gentle, chaste touch. "Good," he said. "Now, let us finish the milking before it rains." They worked together until the pails were full and the cows content, and then they carried the milk up to the dairy house where it would be strained and stored. The clouds were darker now, and the first drops of rain began to patter against the roof as they worked. By the time they finished, it was pouring, a steady drumming that turned the yard to mud. Dominic and Hala dashed back to the main house. laughing breathlessly as they stumbled through the door. They were both soaked, water dripping from their hair and clothes, and Dominic grabbed a towel from the kitchen and tossed it to Hala before fetching another for himself. "Well," he said, wringing out his shirt, "that could have been worse." Hala snorted, rubbing the towel over her face. "How?" she asked. "We could have been carrying the milk pails," Dominic pointed out, and she laughed. A real laugh this time, bright and unguarded. The sound warmed him more than the fire in the hearth, and he found himself grinning like a fool. Hala caught his expression and shook her head, still smiling. "You are ridiculous," she said. "You like it," Dominic said. "I do," Hala admitted, and the softness in her voice made his heart skip. They were interrupted by the sound of footsteps on the stairs, and Marian appeared in the doorway, wrapped in a shawl and looking pale and exhausted. She stopped when she saw them, her gaze flickering between Dominic and Hala, and then she straightened her shoulders. "I am leaving," she announced. "I will pack my things and go today." "Marian," Dominic began, but she held up a hand. "No," she said. "I cannot stay here and watch this. I will not." Dominic felt a stab of frustration and sadness. "You do not have to leave," he said. "This is your home too." "Not anymore," Marian said. Her voice was cold, but Dominic could hear the tremor beneath it. "You have made your choice, Dominic. Now I am making mine." "Where will you go?" Dominic asked. "To Aunt Helen," Marian said. "She will take me in." Dominic nodded slowly. Aunt Helen lived in the town, a 3-hour ride away, and she had always been fond of Marian. It was not a terrible solution, but it still felt like failure. "If that is what you want," he said quietly. "It is," Marian said. She looked at Hala, her expression unreadable. "I hope you know what you are doing," she said, and then she turned and went back upstairs. Hala was very still, her hands clenched around the towel. "I am sorry," she said. "Do not be," Dominic said. "This is not your fault." "It feels like it is," Hala said. Dominic stepped closer and took her hand. "Marian is making her own choice," he said. "Just as I am making mine, just as you are making yours. We all have to live with the consequences." Hala nodded, but she did not look convinced. They spent the rest of the morning in a strange, tense quiet, listening to Marian move about upstairs, packing her belongings. By noon, the rain had slowed to a drizzle, and Marian came down with her trunk. Dominic helped her load it into the small cart, and then they stood together in the yard, the silence stretching between them. "I do not hate you," Marian said finally, her voice tight. "I do not even hate her, but I cannot be happy for you, Dominic. Not yet." "I understand," Dominic said, though the words felt hollow. Marian climbed into the cart and took up the reins. "Take care of yourself," she said, and then she was gone, the cart splashing through the puddles as it rolled down the lane. Dominic stood there for a long time, watching until she disappeared around the bend. When he turned back to the house, he found Hala standing in the doorway, her arms wrapped around herself. "She will come back," Dominic said, though he was not sure if he believed it. "Maybe," Hala said. "But not for me." Dominic walked up to her and took her hands. "Then we will build something new," he said. "Something that is ours." Hala looked up at him, and slowly she nodded. "All right," she said. "Let us try." The days that followed were both easier and harder than Dominic had expected. Without Marian's presence, the house felt quieter, less fraught, but there was also a lingering sadness that neither of them could quite shake. Hala threw herself into her work with renewed determination, and Dominic found himself doing the same. They fell into a rhythm, a partnership that was as much about shared labor as it was about shared affection. But the question of Hala's place in the household, her place in Dominic's life, remained unresolved. She still slept in the small room off the kitchen, still rose before dawn to tend the dairy, still moved through the world with the careful, self-effacing grace of someone who did not quite believe they belonged. And Dominic, for all his declarations, did not know how to convince her otherwise. He thought about it constantly as he worked the fields, as he mended fences, as he sat by the fire in the evenings with Hala beside him, both of them too tired to talk but content in each other's presence. He needed to do something tangible, something that would prove to Hala and to the world that she was not merely tolerated but valued, cherished, essential. The answer came to him one evening as he reviewed the estate's account books. The dairy had grown significantly since Hala's arrival, her knowledge and skill transforming it from a modest operation into something genuinely profitable. She had introduced techniques from her clan's traditions, ways of culturing milk into cheeses that commanded high prices at the market. She had built relationships with the merchants, her straightforward manner and refusal to haggle dishonestly earning their respect. The dairy was thriving, and it was largely because of her, and yet, on paper, she owned none of it. She was still listed as hired help, paid a weekly wage. It was a decent wage, more than fair, but it was not equity. It was not partnership. Dominic stared at the ledger for a long time, an idea taking shape in his mind. It was bold, perhaps even reckless, but it felt right. He closed the book and went to find Hala. She was in the kitchen, kneading dough for the next day's bread. Her sleeves were rolled up, her hands dusted with flour, and she looked up when he entered, a question in her eyes. "Can we talk?" Dominic asked. "Of course," Hala said, setting the dough aside and wiping her hands on her apron. "Is something wrong?" "No," Dominic said. "Not wrong, but I have been thinking." Hala waited, her expression wary, and Dominic took a breath. "The dairy is doing well," he said, "better than it ever has. And that is because of you, Hala, your knowledge, your work, your skill. You have made it what it is." Hala frowned slightly. "I have done my job," she said. "That is all." "It is more than that," Dominic said, "and I want to acknowledge it formally." "What do you mean?" Hala asked slowly. "I want to put part of the dairy into your name," Dominic said. "Make you a co-owner, a true partner." Hala stared at him, her mouth slightly open. "You what?" she said. "The profits from the dairy," Dominic said. "Half of them will be yours. Legally, you will have a stake in it, a claim that no one can take away." Hala shook her head, backing up a step. "Dominic, I cannot. That is too much." "It is not too much," Dominic said firmly. "It is what you have earned, what you deserve." "But Hala faltered, her hands trembling. "I am not Dominic. Your sister already fears I am taking what is not mine. If you do this, she will be proven right." "No," Dominic said. "She will be proven wrong, because this is not about taking. It is about building, together." He stepped closer, his eyes intent on hers. "Hala, I am not doing this to placate you or to prove a point. I am doing this because it is right. The dairy belongs to both of us now. It should be recognized as such." Hala's eyes were bright with unshed tears. "You are giving me a future," she whispered. "A place that is mine. Do you understand what that means to me?" "I think I do," Dominic said gently. "And I want you to have it, not as a gift, as your due." Hala covered her face with her hands, her shoulders shaking. Dominic hesitated, and then he stepped forward and pulled her into his arms. She resisted for a moment, and then she collapsed against him, sobbing into his chest. He held her tightly, his hands smoothing over her back, and he felt his own throat tighten with emotion. "I do not deserve you," Hala choked out. "Yes, you do," Dominic said, "and I will keep telling you that until you believe it." They stood there for a long time, wrapped in each other, and when Hala finally pulled back, her eyes were red but her expression was calmer. "How do we do this?" she asked. "Legally, I mean." "I will speak to the magistrate in town," Dominic said. "Draw up the papers." "It will take a few days, but it can be done." Hala nodded slowly. "And what will people say?" she asked. Your neighbors, the town, let them say what they will, Dominic said. We know the truth. Hala smiled, a tremulous, fragile thing. You are either the best man I have ever known, she said, or the most stubborn. I told you, Dominic said, smiling back. Both. The trip to town took most of a day. Dominic rode alone, leaving Hala to manage the farm in his absence. The magistrate, a gray-haired man named Wilmot, listened to Dominic's request with raised eyebrows. You want to grant an orc woman co-ownership of your dairy, he repeated. Yes, Dominic said evenly. Wilmot leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled. That is highly unusual, he said. Unusual but not illegal, Dominic pointed out. No, Wilmot admitted. Not illegal, but it will cause talk, young Xavier, you must know that. I do, Dominic said, and I do not care. Wilmot studied him for a long moment and then he sighed. Very well, he said. I will draw up the documents, but I advise you to think carefully about this. Once it is done, it cannot easily be undone. I do not want it undone, Dominic said. Wilmot nodded and pulled out a sheaf of paper. They spent the next hour working through the details, the exact boundaries of the dairy's operation, the division of profits, the terms of the partnership. By the time they finished, Dominic's hand was cramped from signing his name, and Wilmot looked weary. I will have a copy ready for you in 3 days, Wilmot said. You and the orc woman Hala, you said, will both need to sign it. Thank you, Dominic said. He left the magistrate's office and walked through the town, feeling the weight of curious stares on his back. News traveled fast in a small town, and he had no doubt that by tomorrow everyone would know what he had done. He bought a few supplies, sugar, salt, a new knife for the kitchen, and then headed back to the farm. Hala was waiting for him when he arrived, her face anxious. How did it go? She asked. It is done, Dominic said. We just need to sign the papers when they are ready. Hala exhaled, relief and disbelief mingling in her expression. I still cannot believe you are doing this, she said. Believe it, Dominic said. He dismounted and handed her the reins. Because in 3 days you will be a landowner. Hala laughed, a sound edged with wonder. A landowner, she repeated. Me, you, Dominic confirmed. He reached out and tucked a loose strand of hair behind her pointed ear. Get used to it. Hala caught his hand and held it against her cheek, her eyes closing. Thank you, she whispered. You do not need to thank me, Dominic said. This is as much for me as it is for you. Hala opened her eyes and looked at him, and there was something fierce and tender in her gaze. I love you, she said, the words tumbling out in a rush. I have wanted to say it for so long, but I was afraid. I am still afraid. But I love you, Dominic Xavier, and I do not think I can hold it in any more. Dominic felt his heart swell, a rush of emotion so strong it left him breathless. I love you too, he said, his voice rough. I have loved you for months, Hala. I think I loved you from the moment you walked into my yard and demanded work. Hala laughed, and then she kissed him, a fierce, clumsy kiss that tasted of salt and sweetness. Dominic kissed her back, his arms wrapping around her waist, pulling her close. They stood there in the yard, the sun setting behind them, and for that moment the rest of the world did not matter. The 3 days passed quickly, filled with the usual work of the farm and the quiet, growing certainty between them. They talked late into the night, sharing stories and dreams, and they woke early to tend the animals together. It was a simple life, but it was theirs, and Dominic found himself more content than he had ever been. On the 3rd day, they rode to town together. Hala wore her best dress, a deep blue linen that brought out the richness of her green skin, and Dominic wore his good coat. They drew stares as they walked through the streets, some curious, some disapproving, but Hala held her head high, and Dominic stayed close beside her. Magistrate Wilmot greeted them with professional courtesy and laid out the documents on his desk. "This is a partnership agreement," he explained, pointing to the text. "It grants Hala Brighthorn co-ownership of the dairy operation on the Xavier estate, with equal claim to profits and equal responsibility for debts. Both parties must sign, and the agreement will be witnessed and filed." Dominic picked up the pen and signed his name with a flourish. Then he handed the pen to Hala. She took it with trembling fingers, staring down at the document. "Are you certain?" she asked quietly, looking up at Dominic. "I have never been more certain of anything," Dominic said. Hala nodded, and then she bent over the paper and carefully wrote her name. Her handwriting was neat and precise, learned during her childhood in the clan before everything fell apart. When she finished, she set down the pen and looked at Magistrate Wilmot. "It is done," Wilmot said. He added his own signature as a witness and pressed the estate seal into the wax at the bottom of the page. "Congratulations, Miss Brighthorn. You are now a landowner." Hala stared at the document, and then she started to cry, silent tears streaming down her face. Dominic put his arm around her shoulders and she leaned into him, her body shaking with emotion. "Thank you," she whispered again, and Dominic kissed the top of her head. They left the magistrate's office with the signed copy of the agreement, carefully rolled and tied with a ribbon. The walk back to the horses felt different somehow, lighter, as though a weight had been lifted. Hala kept touching the rolled document tucked into her bag, as though to reassure herself it was real. On the ride home, she was quiet, her eyes distant. Dominic let her be, understanding that she needed time to process what had just happened. But as they neared the farm, she spoke. "My mother used to say that land was the only thing that truly mattered," she said. "Not gold, not jewels, but land. Because land gave you a place to stand, a place to belong. When our lands were taken, she said we had lost more than our home. We had lost our standing in the world." She looked at Dominic, her eyes wet. "You have given that back to me. You have given me a place to stand." "You always had that," Dominic said. "I just made it official." Hala smiled through her tears. "You are a good man, Dominic Xavier." "I am a man in love," Dominic said simply. "That is all." When they arrived back at the farm, the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. They put the horses away and walked up to the house together, and Dominic felt a sense of peace settle over him. They had taken a step, a real step, toward building the life they both wanted, but there was still more to do. That evening, as they sat by the fire, Dominic brought up the subject that had been weighing on his mind. "I think we should have another supper," he said. Hala looked up from the sock she was mending, her brow furrowed. "Another supper," she repeated. "Why?" "Because the last one ended poorly," Dominic said. "And I want to show the neighbors and anyone else who cares to look that you are not merely tolerated here. You are essential." Hala set down the sock, her expression wary. "I do not know if that is a good idea," she said. "Your sister. I will invite Marion," Dominic said, "and I will ask her to come with an open mind. If she refuses, that is her choice, but I want to give her the chance." Hala was quiet for a moment, her fingers twisting the yarn. "And if she comes and says something cruel again?" she asked. "Then I will handle it," Dominic said, "but I do not think she will. She has had time to think, time to calm down, and she is not a cruel person, Hala. She is just frightened." "Frightened people do cruel things," Hala pointed out. "They do," Dominic agreed, "but they can also learn. And I have to believe that Marion can." Hala sighed and nodded. "All right," she said. "If you think it is worth trying, then we will try." Dominic reached over and took her hand. "Thank you," he said. The invitation was sent to Marion the next day, along with a carefully worded letter explaining what had happened, the partnership agreement, Dominic's intentions, and his hope that she would come and see for herself, that this was not a loss for the family, but a gain. He also wrote to several of the neighbors, inviting them for supper in 2 weeks' time. The responses trickled in over the next few days. Most of the neighbors accepted, though their replies were polite rather than warm. Marion's response came last, a single line scrawled on a piece of paper. "I will come. That is all I can promise." Dominic took it as a victory, small though it was. The days leading up to the supper were a flurry of activity. Hala threw herself into preparations, determined to prove that she was capable of hosting a proper meal. She baked bread and pies, cured a ham, and made a rich cheese from the dairy's best milk. Dominic helped where he could, chopping vegetables and setting the table, and together they transformed the dining hall into something warm and welcoming. On the evening of the supper, Hala changed into the blue dress she had worn to the magistrate's office, and Dominic wore his good coat again. They stood together in the hall, waiting for the guests to arrive, and Dominic could feel the tension radiating from her. "It will be all right," he said quietly. "You do not know that," Hala said. "No," Dominic admitted, "but I believe it." The first guests arrived shortly after, the wool merchant and his wife. They greeted Dominic warmly and nodded politely to Hala, and Dominic counted it as a success. The neighbors followed, filing in with careful courtesy, and then, finally, Marion. She looked tired, her face drawn, but she was dressed well and carried herself with the same quiet dignity she always had. She greeted Dominic with a brief kiss on the cheek, and then she turned to Hala. "Miss Brighthorn," she said, her voice stiff but not unkind. "Miss Xavier," Hala replied, equally formal. They stood there for a moment, the air thick with unspoken words, and then Marion nodded and moved past her into the dining hall. Dominic exchanged a glance with Hala, and she gave him a faint, strained smile. The meal began with the same careful politeness that had marked the previous supper. The guests complimented the food, discussed the weather, and avoided any topic that might lead to conflict. Dominic played the host with practiced ease, and Hala sat beside him, her hands folded in her lap, her back straight. It was Marion who finally broke the careful détente. She set down her fork and looked across the table at Hala. "I understand you are now co-owner of the dairy," she said. The room went quiet. Hala lifted her chin and met Marion's gaze. "I am," she said. Marion nodded slowly. "That is quite an achievement," she said, and there was something in her voice that Dominic could not quite read. "For someone who arrived here with nothing." Hala's jaw tightened. "I arrived with skills," she said, "and a willingness to work." "That is true," Marion said. She glanced at Dominic and then back at Hala. "I owe you an apology," she said quietly. "What I said at the last supper was unkind and unfair. You are not a servant. I should not have called you one." Hala stared at her, clearly taken aback. "Thank you," she said after a moment. "That means a great deal." Marion smiled faintly, and it did not quite reach her eyes, but it was genuine nonetheless. "I do not pretend to understand my brother's choices," she said. "But I can see that he cares for you, and I can see that you care for him. That is enough for me to try." "Try what?" Hala asked. "To accept this," Marion said. "To accept you." She paused, and then she added, "I am frightened, Miss Brighthorn. Frightened that my family will forget me, that I will be cast aside. But I am beginning to realize that is not your fault. It is my own fear talking." Dominic felt his throat tighten with emotion. He reached under the table and squeezed Hala's hand, and she squeezed back. "You will not be cast aside," Dominic said. "You are my sister, Marion. That will never change." Marion's eyes shone with tears, but she blinked them back. "I know," she said. "I am starting to believe it." The rest of the meal passed more easily, the tension easing as the guests relaxed. The wool merchant told a long, rambling story about a sheep that had escaped his pen, and the neighbors laughed. Hala contributed to the conversation, her voice growing more confident as the evening went on, and Dominic watched her with a sense of pride that bordered on awe. When the meal was finished and the guests began to depart, Marian lingered. She approached Hala, her hands twisting together. "I have been thinking," she said, "about what my future might look like. And I have realized that I have been clinging to the past, to what Father wanted, rather than thinking about what I want." She took a breath. "I have been offered a position as a teacher in the town. Aunt Helen arranged it. It is not much, but it is mine, and I think I would like to accept it." Hala smiled. "That sounds wonderful," she said. Marian smiled back, and this time it was warmer. "Thank you," she said, "and I hope we can be friends, Miss Brighthorn, in time." "I would like that," Hala said, "and please call me Hala." Marian nodded. "Hala," she repeated. She looked at Dominic. "You chose well, brother." "I know," Dominic said, grinning. Marian shook her head, but she was smiling as she left when the last of the guests had gone and the house was quiet again. Dominic and Hala stood together in the dining hall, surveying the remnants of the meal. "That went better than I expected," Hala admitted. "It did," Dominic agreed. He turned to her and took her hands. "You were magnificent," Hala laughed. "I was terrified," she said. "You did not show it," Dominic said. "You held your head high and you spoke with confidence. You proved to everyone in that room that you belong here." Hala's eyes softened. "I am beginning to believe it," she said. Dominic pulled her into his arms and kissed her, slow and deep. When they finally broke apart, both of them were breathless. "Marry me," Dominic said. Hala stared at him. "What? Marry me," Dominic repeated. "Be my wife. Let us build this life together officially in every way." Hala's hands came up to cover her mouth, her eyes wide. You are serious." "I have never been more serious," Dominic said. Hala laughed, a wild, joyful sound, and threw her arms around his neck. "Yes," she said. "Yes, yes, yes." Dominic spun her around, both of them laughing like children, and when he set her down, he kissed her again, pouring all his love and hope and certainty into the touch. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind. Dominic and Hala made plans for the wedding, a small affair to be held at the farm with the neighbors and a few close friends in attendance. Marian agreed to stand as Dominic's witness, and Hala asked one of the merchant's wives, a kind woman who had been unfailingly polite, to stand as hers. The ceremony was simple but beautiful, held in the late afternoon when the light slanted golden through the trees. Hala wore a dress of deep green that made her skin glow, and Dominic wore his best suit. The local priest, a man who had known Dominic since childhood, performed the rites with quiet dignity, and when he pronounced them husband and wife, the small gathering erupted in applause. Dominic kissed his bride, and Hala kissed him back, and for that moment the world was perfect. The celebration that followed was warm and joyful, with food and drink and music provided by a neighbor who played the fiddle. Dominic danced with Hala, her laughter ringing out as he spun her across the yard, and he felt a happiness so complete it was almost overwhelming. As the evening wore on and the guests began to drift away, Dominic found Marian standing at the edge of the yard, watching the festivities with a thoughtful expression. "Thank you for coming," Dominic said, stepping up beside her. "Of course," Marian said. She glanced at him. "She makes you happy." "She does," Dominic said. Marian nodded. "Then I am glad," she said. "Truly." "What about you?" Dominic asked. "Are you happy?" Marian considered the question. "I think I am starting to be," she said. "The teaching position is more fulfilling than I expected. And I am learning to build my own life rather than clinging to yours." "Good," Dominic said. He put his arm around her shoulders and squeezed gently. "You deserve that." Marian smiled and leaned into him. "So do you," she said. The guests departed one by one, until only Dominic and Hala remained, standing together in the yard under the stars. Hala leaned against him, her head resting on his shoulder, and Dominic wrapped his arms around her. "Are you happy?" he asked softly. "I am," Hala said. "I did not think I could be. I did not think I deserved to be, but I am." "You deserve all the happiness in the world," Dominic said. Hala tilted her head up and kissed him, slow and sweet. "Thank you," she whispered against his lips, "for seeing me, for choosing me." "Thank you," Dominic replied, "for letting me." They stood there for a long time, wrapped in each other and the quiet peace of the night, and Dominic knew, with a certainty that ran bone deep, that this was where he was meant to be. With this woman in this place, building a life that was theirs and theirs alone. The seasons turned and the farm thrived. The dairy continued to grow, its reputation spreading to neighboring towns, and Hala's cheeses became sought-after commodities at the markets. She managed the operation with skill and confidence, and Dominic found himself deferring to her judgment more often than not. She had a head for business and a way with the merchants that he admired, and he was proud to stand beside her as her partner in every sense of the word. Marian visited often, her initial wariness giving way to genuine affection for Hala. The two women would sit together in the kitchen, talking and laughing, and Dominic would watch them with a sense of contentment that felt almost surreal. His sister had found her own path, and she was happier for it. The neighbors, too, had come around, slowly but surely. There were still those who looked askance at the orc woman who had married into the Xavier estate, but most had seen the evidence of her character and her work, and they could not deny the prosperity she had brought. The awkwardness faded, replaced by a cautious respect that grew warmer with each passing season. One spring morning, as Dominic and Hala worked side by side in the dairy, she paused and set down the churn she had been working. She looked at him with a strange expression, a mixture of nervousness and joy. "I need to tell you something," she said. Dominic straightened, concerned. "What is it?" "I am with child," Hala said. Dominic stared at her, the words taking a moment to register. Then he broke into a wide grin and crossed the room in 2 strides, pulling her into his arms. "That is wonderful," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "That is the best news I have ever heard." Hala laughed, her arms wrapping around him. "I was worried you would be overwhelmed," she said. "With the farm and the dairy and everything else." "Overwhelmed," Dominic repeated. He pulled back and looked at her, cupping her face in his hands. "Hala, I am overjoyed. We are going to have a child, our child." Hala's eyes filled with tears and she nodded. "I know," she said. "I can hardly believe it." They stood there, holding each other, and Dominic felt a wave of love so powerful it left him breathless. This was everything he had ever wanted, everything he had never dared to hope for. A home, a partner, a family. And it was all because of the fierce, beautiful orc woman who had walked into his life and changed it forever. The months passed, and Hala's belly grew round with their child. She continued to work, though Dominic fussed over her constantly, insisting she rest more and let him handle the heavier tasks. She tolerated his fussing with good-natured patience, and they spent the evenings planning for the baby's arrival, turning the small room off the kitchen into a nursery. Marian visited often during this time, bringing gifts and advice, and Hala grew closer to her than Dominic had ever imagined possible. The two women would sit together, sewing tiny garments and talking in low voices, and Dominic would watch them with a sense of wonder. When the baby finally came, it was a long and difficult labor. Dominic paced the hall outside the bedroom, his heart in his throat, while the midwife and Marian attended to Hala. The hours stretched on, and he felt every one of them like a knife. But finally, as dawn broke, he heard the thin, reedy cry of a newborn, and his knees nearly buckled with relief. The midwife opened the door and beckoned him in. "Come meet your son," she said, smiling. Dominic entered the room, his heart pounding, and found Hala propped up in bed, pale and exhausted but glowing with joy. In her arms was a tiny, wrinkled baby with a shock of dark hair and skin that was a soft, mottled blend of green and pink. "His name is Gareth," Hala said, her voice hoarse. "Gareth Xavier." Dominic knelt beside the bed and looked down at his son, and he felt his eyes sting with tears. "He is perfect," he whispered. "He is ours," Hala said, and she smiled at him, a radiant, exhausted smile. "Our son." Dominic leaned forward and kissed her forehead, and then he gently touched the baby's tiny hand. Gareth's fingers curled around his, and Dominic felt his heart swell with a love so fierce and protective it almost hurt. "Thank you," he said to Hala, "for this, for everything." "Thank you," Hala replied, her eyes shining, "for giving me a life I never thought I could have." Marian, standing at the doorway, wiped at her eyes. "He is beautiful," she said softly. "Congratulations." Dominic looked up at his sister and smiled. "Thank you," he said, "for everything." "For being here." Marian smiled back. "Where else would I be?" she said. The years that followed were full and rich. Gareth grew into a bright, curious boy with his mother's dark eyes and his father's easy smile. He was followed, 3 years later, by a daughter named Clara, a fierce little thing with green skin and a temper to match. The farm continued to prosper, and Hala's reputation as a skilled cheesemaker spread far and wide. Dominic and Hala worked side by side, raising their children and managing the estate, and they built a life that was exactly what they had dreamed of, a life of partnership and love, of hard work and shared joy. There were challenges, of course, moments of doubt and difficulty, but they faced them together, and they emerged stronger for it. Marian became a beloved aunt, visiting often and bringing gifts and stories. She eventually married a scholar from the town, a quiet, bookish man who adored her, and they built a life of their own. But she remained close to Dominic and Hala, and their children grew up knowing her as a constant, loving presence. One evening, many years after that first fateful supper, Dominic and Hala sat together on the porch, watching the sun set over the fields. Their children were playing in the yard, Gareth teaching Clara how to skip stones in the pond, and the air was filled with the sound of their laughter. "Do you ever think about that night?" Hala asked quietly. "When Marian called me a servant?" Dominic looked at her surprised. "Sometimes," he admitted. "Why?" Hala smiled faintly. "Because it was the night everything changed," she said. "The night you stood up for me. The night I realized that maybe, just maybe, I could have this." "You always could have," Dominic said. "You just needed to believe it." "I know," Hala said. She leaned her head against his shoulder. "I believe it now." Dominic put his arm around her and pulled her close. "Good," he said. "Because I am not letting you go." Hala laughed softly. "I am not going anywhere," she said. They sat there in comfortable silence, watching the children and the setting sun, and Dominic felt a deep, abiding contentment settle over him. This was his life, the life he had chosen, the life he had fought for. And it was more than he had ever hoped for. As the last light faded and the stars began to appear, Gareth called out, "Papa, Mama, come see. I can skip it 4 times now." Dominic and Hala rose and walked down to the pond, their hands entwined. And Dominic thought that this simple, perfect moment was what happiness truly looked like. Not grand gestures or dramatic declarations, but the quiet, everyday joy of being with the people you loved, building a life together, one day at a time. And as he watched his son show off his newfound skill, his daughter cheering him on and his wife laughing beside him, Dominic knew that he had everything he needed. He had his family, his home, and the woman he loved more than life itself. It was more than enough. It was everything.